Hello, all, and welcome to the Fantasy and Sci-Fi Fanatics podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Coolbaugh. Today, I have with me a very special guest, Matthew Harffy. Matthew, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Anytime. I love when I can get historical fiction people on here. There's not many times. I had Scott Oden and a couple others on. So, like I said before we get started, my audience knows I teach history. I love it. It's one of my passions. So I love talking to people about their writing when it comes to historical fiction. So very, very excited to have you on today.
I thought you made a mistake when you invited me. I thought, I don't write fantasy. What's going on?
Well, when I first started this, I thought, I just feel like there's so much that, so many of the roots from fantasy, come from historical fiction. That's where I started, in terms of reading was historical fiction. And, my friend's like, oh, try this. I'm like, no, that's not for me. And then I, got into sci-fi and he's like, well, you like Star Wars. He's like, Star Wars is basically, fantasy and sci-fi. And, I love the history of Star Wars. Like that was a big thing. So I said, okay, I'll try it. So I tried, Knight's Word, The Hobbit, the Ghost in the Tea House, quite a few. And I really, enjoyed them. But the ones I had read were more historical fiction based than I'd say it's like light fantasy. So I was like, oh, that might be a good idea. I think a lot of people I talk to, have said the same thing. You still got the swords and, you got the lifestyles and, the time periods. And I think it's fun too, that people take a look at what you guys are writing historical fiction and think, okay, now like Gaslight fantasy in particular, people are picking different, time eras and things like that, to base their fantasy off. So for me, I still think that those roots are important to go back and look. And like I said, I love history. So
I think it's interesting that you said that you started off with historical fiction, then sort of moved over to fantasy. I think I probably went the other way. So a teenager, I used to read. I still play Dungeons and Dragons, and I used to be a massive fantasy role-playing game fan and nerd. Played all sorts of games, and used to like the Star Wars, but also read Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and Conan and all of those sort of things. So I was a massive fan of fantasy and sword and sorcery, and then ended up writing basically sword and sorcery, but without the sorcery and without the dragons. So it's like Dungeons and Dragons, but without the monsters.
Yeah.
Human monsters instead.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting. I was talking to Scott Oden about this, and we were discussing the historical fiction roots and things like that for sword and sorcery, and he did make a really good point where we were talking about historical fiction, and it is fun with fantasy because it does add a whole nother element, but it also I think is fun as a writer to just do historical fiction, because then you don't have magic to rely on. You really just have the people that are involved and their ingenuity, their know-how, their skills. And I think like obviously like Uhtred of Beddenberg is one of my favorite characters of all time. I think they did an amazing job capturing his character in Netflix TV show, but the books too, that I think Bernard Cornwell does a really good job of showing just the human condition, and just that we're very desperate times, and we still are, in very desperate times, in a lot of the senses. And I think that human interaction piece, sometimes it does help in fantasy, coming from a historical context, but at times I do think, some things are lost. So that's why I still like to go back to just historical fiction. So yeah, it ends up being really cool when you just go back and just read historical fiction. But for that first question there, what has your writing journey been like up until this point?
Well, interesting. You should ask. And a good segue there. I can actually mention Uhtred of Bebbanburg and Bernard Cornwell. So, I mean, my books. So I've written the most of my books. I've a series called the Bernicia Chronicles, and I actually started writing the first one, which is The Serpent's Sword, back in 2001. After seeing a documentary about some burials, some bones that are being dug up just to the south of Bamborough Castle. And when I say just to the south, I mean within sight of the walls of Bamborough Castle. And they dated back from like the 7th and 8th century. And this documentary talked about how Bebbanburg was so Bamborough Castle is Bebbanburg. Okay, so just to put that in context. And I'd lived up near Bamborough Castle as a kid for a few years, and I saw this documentary, and they talked about how Bamborough or Bebbanburg had been the center of the kingdom of Bernicia and then later Northumbria, and how Northumbria was really important back in the early medieval period. And I didn't really know anything about that history, but I did recognize the place, and I was really interested in the place. And as I said, I had this affinity to sword and sorcery and the whole sort of idea of these Anglo-Saxons there and the swords and, you know, I don't know, just the long ships and the people at the time and the rugged coastline. It all sort of conjured up something in my memory and my psyche. And I just decided to start writing. I wrote what turned out to be the beginning of the first chapter of The Serpent's Sword the same night that I saw this documentary.
Oh, wow.
And now the link to Bernard Cornwell is I'd read Bernard Cornwell before. I was a big fan of Bernard Cornwell's. And I think one of the things that spurred me onto writing as well was reading his Arthur series. So he wrote the trilogy, I think it's called The Warlord Chronicles. Yep. And it's a trilogy based on the stories of King Arthur, but very much based in sort of a real Dark Ages, early medieval period. And he wrote those in the late 90s. So I started writing my books very much in that sort of style, I guess. And then a few years later, so maybe 3 years later, I'm still plodding away. I've got a full-time job and a young family and trying to write. I had no idea how to go about writing a novel, let alone a historical one, when I didn't really know any of the history. So I started buying, you know, some of the books that you can see on the shelf behind me. They're all these are non-fiction, you know, history books. And I started buying these books and reading up and researching and writing. Anyway, one day Bernard Cornwell brings out a new book called The Last Kingdom in 2004. And I thought, okay, this sounds good. But I bought it and started reading it, and starts off in Bebbanburg. My book starts in Bebbanburg, and it's a young warrior. My book is a young warrior starting in Bebbanburg, and my book set a couple of 100 years earlier. It starts in 633, cool. the Serpent's Sword, and so it's before the Vikings. So it is different, but there was enough similarity to it that I felt incredibly deflated. And I think this has happened to many writers, that you start writing something and then somebody comes along. And you see it in movies as well, right? A movie comes out. I remember in the 90s, I was massively into, I've always been into Westerns and stuff. And the Wyatt Earp came out, the Kevin Costner movie, and Tombstone came out like the same year. You know, so you see two movies about Wyatt Earp at the same time. I think Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves came out, and there was like another Robin Hood movie came out at the same time. So it seems to happen a lot in different cultural areas. I don't really know why, but this seemed to happen to me, and I felt like, oh my god, I can't write now. This guy's a huge monster in the industry. So I really gave up writing for years, and I didn't pick it up until 2012, 2013, something like that. And I then, with the advent of self-publishing, I decided, look, I need to finish this story, even if I self-publish it. You know, before, when I started writing, self-publishing didn't really exist. So then, with the advent of Kindle, I thought, okay, I can self-publish, I can get this out there. So then I went through the motions, got an agent, finished the book, got an agent, tried to sell it, failed to sell it to all the major publishers in the UK. I'd written a sequel by that point as well, The Cross and the Curse, which is the second book in the series. My agent basically said, well, we've not managed to sell it anywhere, so throw those books away and, you know, off you go, write something else. Because that's how agents think. They just think, well, I've tried to sell it, didn't sell it. And I was like, hang on a minute, what? I'm not doing that. I was still working full time, but I thought there's no way I'm throwing away these books. I worked in technical writing at the time, so I was writing manuals for like IT for a software company. So I had the skills to create the PDFs and to stick things up in the right formats that they needed, to do the covers and all that. So I did everything myself, and I self-published The Serpent's Sword, and then I self-published the Cross and the Curse, and I got someone to come along in authentic gear, a reenactor, amateur historian called Matt Bunker, came in all authentic sort of 7th century gear, and a friend of mine, I'll name check him as well, so Stephen Weatherly, a friend of mine from work, keen photographer, he took the photos for the cover, and I did the covers, and I put those books out there, and they sold really well. I got endorsements from writers that I asked, and I sold a few thousand copies. And suddenly, you know, once you sell a few thousand copies and you get 100 reviews on Amazon, then the publisher's a bit more interested. So in the end, I then traditionally published those first 2 books. I took them off the market and then traditionally published them. And you know, the rest is history, as they say. And so yeah, I've been traditionally published ever since. but with that sort of rooting in in self-publishing originally, and that's kind of been my journey into publishing. But sort of go back to the Bernard Cornwell thing and finish off that sort of little thing. My series has gone on, and obviously his series has gone on from strength to strength, and then there's the TV series and done fantastically well. But I realized very quickly that although a few people would say, oh, it's not as good as Bernard Cornwell's books, most people, they just want to read more of it's like, you read Tolkien, it doesn't mean you can't enjoy G.R.R. Martin just because you enjoyed Tolkien, even though they're both fantasy novels, right? I mean, it's the same. People want to read books about with exciting characters and interesting stories based on historical events in the time of the Anglo-Saxons or the Vikings. They don't preclude someone else writing in the same area. If you read a James Bond book, it doesn't mean you can't read other spy books. It's the same kind of thing. And I feel like I've been accepted into the community. I'm a member of the Bernard Cornwell fan club, and got invited to talk at one of their events a couple of years ago, and everybody was lovely, and they loved my books, and obviously they love Bernard Cornwell's more. Well, great, more power to Bernard. but yeah, it's great. I see it as, if Bernard Cornwell's got a great following, and other writers too, then so have I. Great. We can't write as many books as people can read.
So, no, it's so true. Well, that's like, he does have quite a few books, but still, most people that I know, they average, at least, 40 a year, so it's like, all right, Salvatore, I loved him, and I had to branch out after a while. I was all caught up, and I was glad after a while he went back and started writing, again. And I had to take a break because I was like, I'm going to be done with this character that, read my whole life. So that's where I really discovered, like, oh, I like a lot of these other people too in fantasy. So Brandon Sanderson writes a lot, but even he's not that fast compared to,
most writers, the most they write is a couple of novels a year, and that's a fast novelist. Often it's one a year, or even one every 18 months or 2 years. So readers are gonna be reading, as you say, like one every couple of weeks or something, or even faster than that. So your reader's going to want to read a lot more than one book every 2 years. So so they're going to be happy to read different authors.
Especially now with Audible too. Like, I was asking one of my buddies who's a reviewer, I was like, how do you read so many books? He goes, oh, I listen to them in the car. I'm like, and I have a thing against that myself. I don't consider it for myself reading. So
as you're doing a podcast, you probably shouldn't be against the audio
no, market. It's fine. It's fine. I'm totally for it. It's my personal thing.
It's a different experience. I think that I do listen to quite a lot of audiobooks now as well, because it's difficult to find the time always to read. And so, I listen to audiobooks when I'm walking my dog, for example, and that takes, a couple of hours every day of your life. You're doing stuff that you can't actively be walking around reading a book. So I will listen to audiobooks, but there are differences in it. And one of the things is, if you don't like the narrator, it's really problematic. You really struggle to. And I'm listening to a book at the moment, and I don't mind the narrator, but it throws up idiosyncrasies sometimes of the writing. So it's actually is it Robert Parker? Robert J. Parker, I think, is a Western, and he writes, like, after every line of dialogue, he says he said, or she said, he said, but all the time. And it's when you get someone reading it, it becomes really annoying. So it's like, hello, he said, hello, she said. What are you doing? He said. And when you're hearing it narrated, it becomes, when you're reading it, you just ignore those he said, she said. But when there's too many of them, it's like, wow, why have you got one like at the end of every word almost? It does feel strange. But anyway.
Well, I had one very famous author, I won't say who, where like I read 7 of their books, and I was so glad that I read. This is my rule for myself ever since this happened. So I got through 7 of their books, and then I decided the 8th one, I was like, oh, I didn't have it with me. So I was like, oh, I'll just listen to the audiobook, and then I'll my paperback will be here, in 3 days. I just couldn't wait. I wish I had waited. So then the narrator, I hated. Like, I hated them. And it took me probably like almost 2 years to go back and actually read book 8. And it just like ruined it for me. So that's like one of my rules to myself now, is like, because I like to do it myself in my head. Like, that's partly why I, read books. I can put the actress, whoever I want there, So ever since that, I'm like, so I actually only listen to audiobooks unless they're nonfiction. But if they're like fantasy or sci-fi, I only listen to audiobooks that I've read, so that doesn't get ruined for me with a bad narrator or somebody that I think is totally different. Because it really like hampered my flow with that series.
I always listen to a sample first, and some books I just think
good idea. Why didn't I
can't listen to that. You can listen to a sample on Audible or whichever. Normally they offer like a 5-minute sample, and sometimes I think I can't do that.
Yeah. That's a good idea. I'm gonna have to start doing that. I didn't even think of that. Just open up a whole new world for me there, Matthew.
There you go. And the other thing that this could be useful to you and to maybe other listeners is you can set the speed as well. So you can change the speed to like 1.2 or something, and it doesn't change the pitch. But if a reader is reading very slowly and they read very slowly and they take a long time to read like this, you can speed it up and they'll be speaking a lot more quickly, but quick enough that you can still follow what's going on, but you get through the book an extra 10% quicker.
That's cool.
So, but it does clever stuff with the software. So it doesn't change the pitch. It doesn't sound like the Chipmunks or something. It just So
wow, that's good to know. Yeah, I had one where I was listening to, and I love the series so much that I had already read it, and I was like, well, this is the only narrator. So, but he did read so slowly. I was like, so that's actually really good to know. When I go back and re-listen to him again, I'll have to do that. I'm sure it'll be a lot more enjoyable this time. Yeah, that's good to know. For that second one there, so what genres do you currently write in, and how did you decide?
So, well, as we've already said, I predominantly write historical fiction. In fact, all of my published novels so far have been historical fiction.
Oh, cool.
And I've been writing, all of them so far have been in the early medieval period. So I've got this books that are set in the 7th century. I mentioned sort of start in 633, and that's a long ongoing series, still continuing. And I've got another series that's set a couple of hundred years later in the early Viking age, right at the beginning of the Viking age. And I've written a standalone as well called Wolf of Wessex, which again is set in the early 9th century. So that's kind of encroaching on Bernard Cornwell's Uhtred time frame. Then almost, it's a little bit before. It's set in the time of Alfred the King, his great grandfather or his grandfather. I think it's his grandfather. No, it's his grandfather, King Egbert of Wessex. And that Wolf of Wessex is set in Wessex, as you can imagine, which is nowadays Wiltshire and Somerset and Hampshire and Dorset, down the south of England. And I live in Wiltshire, so it's sort of basically where I live. And I started writing that soon after, talking about how you choose what to write. I started writing that one soon after we got our dog. And so I'd be walking the dog through the fields, and I ended up writing this story about this old warrior walking around with his big wolf hound, or big hound. So it's basically just wishful thinking that I was some sort of tough warrior guy with an axe, and that my dog, instead of being half miniature poodle and half collie, is actually some massive vicious wolfhound. So that's how did I choose? Well, I told you how I was inspired by this documentary, and I was interested in the history of the time and the place of Northumberland. And that's really how I decided. Just sort of, I don't know, when things spark your imagination. I've written a couple of other things. I mean, this is a fantasy, and you're into fantasy and sci-fi as well. So this podcast predominantly, I guess, is fantasy and sci-fi as well, or just fantasy. Yeah. So I have written a short story which is as yet unpublished. But it's been bought. I mean, I wrote it under commission, but I wrote it like 2 years ago, and I'm expecting at some point it will be published, but who knows? But that's a sci-fi for Warhammer 40,000. So that was from Black Library that they do the Warhammer books. They contacted me. It's like right at the beginning of the first lockdown, or just sort of in the early period of sort of 2020 or mid 2020 or something. I got contacted, and they said, would you consider writing a short story? I'm like, okay, I've never played Warhammer, but whatever. I kind of regretted it to some extent, because I didn't realize how much lore there was with Warhammer 40,000.
You can't deviate. You can't deviate.
No, I said yes, and they told me how much they were going to pay me, and it wasn't very much money. And I thought, well, it doesn't matter. It'll just be a couple of weeks' work. So it took me like 2 weeks to write the draft, but it took me maybe like another 2 weeks to sort of find the information and stuff from this encyclopedia that they sent me a PDF of. And then the rewrites, honestly, I spent more time in the rewrites of that than for the historical fiction novels.
Yeah.
It was like, well, you can't say this and this is wrong and you need to tweak this because those soldiers didn't use those guns. And I don't know, you know, it was incredibly, honestly, more attention to detail than there is in the historical fiction, I think. But interesting. I'm hopeful that it will come out sometime before Christmas in one of their anthologies. I don't know if it's going to be in an Inferno anthologies that they bring out. So we'll see.
Cool.
I'll let you know. I'll shout about it when it comes out. I've been sworn to secrecy over the title. I'm not even allowed to say the title of the short story. So all I can say is that there are a few Easter eggs that I put in there for my readers. Anybody that reads it, that's read my nonfiction, they will be able to think, oh, there's a link here to something that happened in 633 in the year 40,000 on another planet. Somehow there's some links in some of the things, but I don't think the Warhammer guys got it, but I slipped in a few Easter eggs. But
that's cool.
Yeah, so that's and at the moment I've just finished writing a novella, again historical fiction, I guess, but set in the 19th century. So a big leap. This isn't. I haven't got a contract for it, so I've just written it because I want to. And I don't know if I'm going to publish it or self-publish it, or if it's just a kind of a research proof of concept for myself. But it's set in 1856 in Texas. So as I've never been to Texas. But then again, I've never been to the outer galactic rim of Warhammer 40,000, so I managed to write that. So I think there's probably as much information about both. So yeah, so set in Texas, mid 19th century. I'm a massive Western fan. I've mentioned a couple of times already. So I really want to write a Western. I'm not sure if this novella is going to be the thing to publish because it touches on maybe too many issues of the time that might be difficult for a middle-aged white guy to publish nowadays. So we'll see. But anyway, it's been fun writing, and I've been doing loads of research and buying more books. So I think it's almost going to be like a proof of concept for a novel that maybe doesn't necessarily tackle difficult issues in such a way, but has a bit of a different plot. But we'll see.
Well, that sounds awesome. Yeah, I just think a lot of people, again, we were talking before we started recording. I just think a lot of people dismiss historical fiction, in the fantasy and sci-fi community. I think there's a lot of, I've met a lot of people recently. S. Evan Townsend, he's one where, he has some really cool historical fiction mixed with sci-fi and some fantasy, and I think that, you could do a really good job, blending them together. And I think it's hard, like I was just talking to my artist friend of mine, he's like, I'm really trying to figure out how to get this right blend of colors. And he really went and actually just studied the color red, just studied like crazy, and the kind of different things that people were, were doing with it. And then he was finally able to, get a mixture for the color that he wanted. And I see that a lot too. Like I said, like I have a historical urban fantasy I want to write. I want to get the historical fiction crowd on half, and I like to get the the fantasy or urban fantasy crowd on another one. I want to take the Ninth Roman Legion. I want to take a few of them that survived and turn them into monster hunters, essentially. And I think it just sounds so much fun to me, because I get to take both things of what I love with history and, and fantasy and, mythology and, all this knowledge that I've attained over, 30 years of studying, and put it all into one thing. So yeah, I think, but I do feel that, talking to Scott Oden in particular, I do feel that, it's like, I also talk to people about, a lot of romance authors too. And, not just in terms of their advertising, but in terms of how they write scenes, and I think that if you're not studying different, different forms, I do martial arts. I study a lot of different martial arts styles, and it's not just to know how to attack or defend. It's also knowing how to do certain things. And I feel that's what, writing should be too. I think in order to write really vivid scenes, you really have to study a lot of different, just different styles, and I think, historical fiction is one for me that I'm like, you look at Bernard, and I'm like, I love his books, and Ben's another one, like Ben, I'm trying to get Ben on for a while, and I've talked to a lot of people about his, battles and fight scenes and characters, and I feel like, you guys have a really big grasp on the human condition. And I feel that people need to reanalyze that and then think about bringing that more to make their characters maybe feel more real. So
I think that's really interesting point about the, talking about the human condition and you can talk about all the mechanics of battle and warfare, but if you don't have the aftermath of that on the people and on the characters, then it really doesn't ring true. And even though perhaps, because I've had this discussion with different writers, I think you mentioned Ben, I don't know if you, Ben Kane, and other historical fiction writers that write battle scenes and things, and we've talked about it's perhaps true that in the early medieval period or in the Roman period or far further into the past, that people didn't feel the same. I mean, obviously, humans were the same, but life was cheap, and so people had, the Romans all had slaves, and it was considered normal, and they did horrible things to people, and if somebody did something they didn't like, they were crucified. So it was obviously a very different way of life, and then they would. So life was cheap, and it's possible that people in those times didn't feel the same way that we do about death and about if they killed someone in battle, they might not have been as cut up about it. Or as emotionally impacted, perhaps, I don't know. But by writing now in the 21st century, if you write in a way that you perceive to be realistic and that people maybe of the time and are not that impacted, I think modern audiences won't buy it. So you really need to be writing historical fiction that's authentic feeling for the period, but it's always going to need to be embedded closely in the period you're writing in, which goes back to the fact I was saying about this novella that I've written and touches on certain subjects that I think at the moment it might just not be the right time to publish. That 10 years ago I probably would have published without really thinking too much about it, but because of things that have happened over the last few years, especially with social media and the way things are, the way things kick off in social media, it just becomes difficult to talk about certain things, because you're writing very much in this time, and you need to be sensitive of the audience now. So anyway, it's a long-winded.
No, I do think that because I mean, at being a history teacher in these times too, certain people don't like that we mention certain things, and I literally told a parent a while back, I said, you don't like it, I said, there's another public school right down the road. And they looked at me.
The thing is,
I'm like, I don't know what to tell you.
If you ignore, I mean, I feel quite strongly about it, because I think there is a tendency now to sort of imply that by talking about something you're condoning it, and I think that it's really a massive mistake, because if we don't talk about the past and the horrible things that happened, if I write something horrible, people would say to me, well, you can't write about such and such a subject because you're not of that group of people, so you don't have the right to tell that story. But I think, well, the whole of writing about novels is about writing other people's experience. And if we don't look and examine the horrific things that happened in the past, we're just going to repeat them, and we see that all the time. People are already forgetting the atrocities of the Holocaust, and denying that these things happened, and that's within living lifetime. There's people still alive and it's just, how on earth is this possible? And then we see the rise of fascism beginning to happen again, and the rise of anti-Semitism, and you just think, how is it possible? How is it possible to have people in countries that fought against the Nazis then waving around swastikas and
oh man,
it's crazy. I mean,
my grandfather had such a hard time with that, man. Like, being a young man and being in the Navy, and with World War II, and then coming home. I mean, he just couldn't get over it. He's like, here we literally fought these people, and now they're here in my country. He was like, I didn't fight for this. It's like, it was, and that was one thing he could never get over. I mean,
and in many cases implying that they're patriots. Somehow, it's like, what are you talking about? How's that patriotic? I mean, it's like, what?
Yeah.
Anyway, let's not get too political, but I think you need to look into history. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, but I do think that you make a good point. So like last night, for instance, right? I'm writing I switched to my fantasy because I'm going back to that draft 2, and I put my historical urban fantasy aside for a minute. And I'm like, so I'm going. I'm like, well, I'm thinking to myself, is 2,000 years enough time for people to forget how dangerous these certain things are, or this group of people? And then the news came on. I'm looking on Facebook, and I'm like, never mind. I'm like, apparently 40 years is enough. 2000 should definitely be enough time for people to forget that these things are dangerous, or that, that this thing happened. And you just mentioned that, right? That, it's crazy how, my kids, so we're about to be on World War II, and we took a little segue with the war in Ukraine, to talk about why the dominoes fell, ahead of time. So they got a base for it. And even they were smart enough to be worried, and, we're like, yeah, you got to be really careful now of, maybe some certain countries, who are also looking to expand and things, much like other countries did in World War II, and, took advantage of people
Absolutely.
looking that way, and is
it's
crazy.
It is really interesting. I didn't know. I mean, I just did some research for this Western novella that I've written, and looking into in that research, just looking at the history of Texas, Mexico, and realizing that basically it's somewhere 150 years ago, 170 years ago or something. Texas was Mexico, and you make Texas the Donbass region. The US is, this is really contentious, so you're going to get people complaining about this, but in the concept 170 years ago, the United States was basically playing the role of Russia. Texas was like the Donbass, and Mexico was Ukraine. I mean, it's a similar thing, and it's just like, we want that bit of land, and we'll have a war over it, and now it's our land. And they say, well, no, it's not. And you have a fight for a bit, and then eventually it's a new state.
Well, it's funny because back in the day, like we just got done with Spanish American War, so we decided to use it as a segue for imperialism for the United States into World War I. And I said to the kids, I said, I thought Teddy Roosevelt was a hero for years, and I was reading a bunch of stuff on him. And then once I actually read this guy's book, and, I felt like he had a more objective view of him. And they actually get to San Juan Hill, and I used to have a photograph, copy of, Teddy Roosevelt on San Juan Hill with the Rough Riders. Turns out, they literally took the credit from Buffalo Soldiers, and then had them wait over there while they took a picture, acting like they took San Juan Hill. And I was devastated. I was like, what? Really? And, then, we've really done a lot of deconstructing with mythological, the mythos and things, and, we tried teaching the kids Abraham Lincoln the truth. He was a man who, made mistakes, and, why, if he was this great liberator, why didn't he? A lot of people don't know that he, kept Northern slaves enslaved for an extra 2 years, after the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, because he didn't feel that, Northern white men would fight for the liberation of, of slaves. And I think he was wrong in that, but, it's crazy how, Andrew Jackson, I can't stand Andrew Jackson. All my kids always bring him up to me when they want me to go on a tirade, and they usually do, at least for 60 seconds, with Indian Removal Act. That guy was so racist. He should not be on the $20 bill. Harriet Tubman should definitely be on there instead. She actually saved people and, did a lot for this country, and was a true patriot in my mind, for freedom. And, it's crazy how, we have to do all this deconstructing. And it's interesting that once we actually show kids hey, your ancestors were there, women were here, people of color were here doing this or this and that. And I think that's where historical fiction for me is, is more prevalent, because I was reading about these people with these different experiences the whole time, and so when I read that about Teddy Roosevelt with this guy's very objective, biography, I guess I wasn't as shocked as I thought I was going to be, because I was like, oh, actually, it makes sense, because I read historical fiction where these people had to deal with these sorts of problems.
And he's a product of his time as well as everybody else. And so what to us looks terrible now, he probably didn't even cross his mind as an issue. But
no, sadly, it's crazy. Yeah, I can talk about history all day.
This has become the history channel now.
I know.
Let's talk about history.
So how many books have you currently written? I saw quite a bit on your Goodreads.
So I have written, I can see your next question coming up as well about the series. I can answer both those at the same time.
That's fine.
I've written 12 novels at the moment, and 11 have been published so far, and I've got the 12th one is coming out in December. So there's 2 series, and there's 1 standalone novel that I've released. There's a novella, a couple of novellas as well. One's published. It's kind of a prequel novella to the series. So they've got the series, the Benicia Chronicles. So the 9th book of that is coming out in December. That's called Forest of Foes. Each of the books, so it's the Serpent Sword, the Cross and the Curse, Blood and Blade. I'm not going to name them all, but you can see they've all got alliterative titles. And
Great
that's
titles,
sort
by
of
the way.
thank you. That's kind of harkening back to the Anglo-Saxon Old English poetry, which often uses alliteration.
Oh, that's
And I
cool.
thought this would be a great thing, you know. But I didn't realize I was going to write so many books. And so, getting to book 9, it was like, what do I call this thing? Because each of the titles actually got something about the story as well, you know. So it's not like they're just random words, you know. They have to actually make some sort of sense. So anyway, yeah, we're at Forest of Foes. I have no idea what the next book is going to be called after that, but there are going to be more in the series. And the other series I've got, I've just written 2 so far, and that's the one that's set in the early Viking period. So it starts in 793. And the first one of that is A Time for Swords. And the sequel, which has only just come out actually a couple of months ago, is A Night of Flames.
Oh,
And I have no idea what the third one is going to be called of that, but that's probably going to be the next book I'm going to write, is going to be the third one in that series, and that will be out next year sometime, I guess. And yeah, I've got that other standalone novel, Wolf of Wessex, that I mentioned before.
That's awesome. I just showed my friend some of your titles because I was telling him, I was like, oh, I really need help with this title for this book because I had this great project because I don't have a title. And so I showed him some of your titles. Like, oh, those are really awesome. He's like, you should ask that guy. I was like, that's fair. That's fair. So yeah,
Well, yeah.
we were going over
Ask me. You
them.
can send some ideas my way, and I'll try and put
Yeah,
the
that's awesome.
magic
Yeah.
touch. As long as you don't mind them being alliterative, you know, they'll have to all have the same letter.
Well, it's funny because my friend had, he said, he made a good point. He's like, you really got, I'm actually, because of the Roman history and because like I do so much all over with history, ancient history is more my forte, but not necessarily just Roman. So I'm actually trying to hire a Roman military historian actually to go back through and to critique and things like that. So I'm going to pay somebody as kind of like a little mini editor there, just to make sure that my historical crowd is satisfied, so to speak. But I want to make sure I get things right. I think it's important for historical context and things like that.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I think it's interesting that your titles, they were all really good. I was looking, that's where I just added them all on Goodreads the other day. We were talking. I was like, oh, that looks cool. That looks cool. My wife's like, what are you doing? I was like, don't mind me. I was like, I'm just over here with these 12 books. So, but yeah, awesome titles. I really look forward to cracking them open this summer.
Thank you.
So you talked about a little bit about how you went about your research for your first couple novels. Is there anything that you do differently now? Do you just take a look at those books? I know Google is such a rabbit hole. Like sometimes I want to know something about Native American, mythology or something like that. I try to find people, to talk to. Sometimes it's kind of hard. But what has been the most helpful thing in terms of research that you have found?
Yeah, so what I do most of the time for the early medieval stuff, there's not actually a huge amount, although I've got all those books on the shelves there's not a huge amount of primary source material. So it is really, what I normally do is I try to find a historical event that I'm writing about. In the Bernicia Chronicles specifically, it follows real kings and real bishops and people, and so I'll find some historical pivotal battles or moments, and I'll also research as much as I can about those, but they're usually like one sentence. In the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle or something, it's just there was a battle here and such a king died, and that's it. So a lot of it's kind of researching around that and then coming up with a plot that my characters how they can interplay with the kings and things. In terms of what I use, well, obviously the books, as I mentioned, I'll try to do some research up front, and then eventually I do a bit of plotting and planning for maybe a few weeks, maybe a month or something, and then I just say, right, I'm going to write now, because I get to the point that once I've got a rough structure and a rough sort of idea of how it's going to break down into sections or chapters, I just go for it, and that changes as it's progressing. But as I'm going, I will highlight, I'll get to pieces, and it just happened now with the novella. As I said, I was writing this Western. I didn't know lots of stuff about the history, and especially about the details. So, you kind of know the general stuff, but then you suddenly realize you don't know how, or what drink they were drinking at this time in history, or what they used to cut their bread, or I don't know, or whatever, what type of wheat they were growing, or all really specific details. And those things you don't want to stop and get bogged down into the research. So as I'm writing, I will just put like square brackets and say, the farmers were, and then put like doing something in the field, and I'll just leave a a gap. And then at the end, when I finished writing the novel, because it doesn't matter if they're winnowing wheat or if they're cutting, or if they're weeding it, or if they're cutting down, a tree. It doesn't really matter for the story. It's just to add sort of color to the background. So later on, the first pass of my edit is to go through and look for all these square brackets. And then do the sort of deep dive research, which can be either looking in specific books. I mean, I've got lots of books there about the natural history of the British Isles and trees and things. And so I'll be, some of it is like looking just for like what type of trees are growing in certain areas, because I like to mention those things, because I think in the early medieval people were very, very close to nature, and so they really knew what type of trees there were. Lots of the old English letters, the runes, are actually named after trees. So you got ash is the first letter in the alphabet. It's named after the ash tree, and you got, so they're very much embedded in. So I'd like to use the names of the trees, but I like to make sure I get the right trees, and you need to make sure that they are historically accurate, because lots of trees have been imported from Asia or from America or whatever over the centuries. So. But all of that detail I'll do at the end, and I'll look at the books first. If I can't find it in books, I will go online and go down the rabbit hole of watching all sorts of things for the sort of geography and layout of places. I often end up on YouTube for people walking around certain cities and things.
That's a good idea.
Or even black powder pistols. I went down that rabbit hole the other day of watching guys on YouTube, because firearms is totally, it's very, very difficult in the UK. It's basically nobody can have firearms. You can't. I'm sure I could find somewhere that I could go and maybe shoot a gun somewhere on some range somewhere. But obviously there are people online where in the States is obviously a lot, the regulation is a lot less strict, but there's people that have got videos of reenactment weapons, replica weapons, black powder pistols and stuff, and they're showing how to load them and how to put the percussion caps on and how to all of the stuff, and I didn't know any of that stuff. So you can really find pretty much anything on YouTube. There'll be some expert somewhere that's done some videos. Also, Google Maps and Google Earth is great for sort of seeing the layout of things, and buying maps as well. So that's a good idea. I've got. Recently. As I progress, I'm just trying to find out where the book is. As I progress through the editing process of each book, I end up ordering more books, and this is a book I ordered the other day.
That's cool.
Historical Atlas of the American West, and this is it's got all really interesting things about overland mail. Oregon, California trail, the great sheep trails. It breaks down all the different things, Texas trails, and so it breaks down all the different pieces that you might find useful. And I've got something similar for I've got an Anglo-Saxon one.
Oh, that's awesome.
Over there, Atlas of Anglo-Saxon England is up there as well. So you get these historical atlases, which are really useful. And modern day maps sometimes. So sometimes you can't find an old map. So I've got like a tourist map of Norway that I was using for like just looking at Norwegian fjords and things when I was writing A Night of Flames, because they end up going to Norway. So everything and anything at my disposal. I'd love to visit all the places in the flesh, but it's just impossible, especially over COVID. Of course, it's been impossible, and it's kind of difficult. It's always a bit difficult to try to convince my family that it actually makes sense that I'm just going to go off for a week to Norway or something on my own. That doesn't tend to fly for some reason. So
that's fair. It's for research.
It's research. Honestly, honey, I'll see you later. I'm writing about the Bahamas. Yeah, that would be my.
That's awesome. Yeah, I definitely understand that. I've tried that a couple times. I'm just gonna go to Ireland this week, honey, and my wife said no for some reason. So
I don't know why.
Yeah, that's a good idea though. I do like I never thought of looking up historical atlases of things like that. So actually I wrote that down. So that's
I found this American West one. I sort of just found out of by
I definitely need that one.
Well, if you look at so I use a site called I don't know if it's I presume it's in the States as well. Abe Books. So ABE Books.
I love
and it's all secondhand.
They're awesome.
Books. And that's where I get lots of them. So that atlas was a secondhand book. So often lots of these academic books are really expensive. If you get them secondhand, I got another book the other day again off Abe Books. This was like £4 or something. This was originally written in like 1948.
Oh,
and then
wow.
reprinted it. This is like a reprint from 1961 or something. But this cost me just a few bucks. But
That's such a good idea, though. I don't know why I never thought of doing that, because there were a couple of different books that I wanted on like military, like Roman military history, but they were just so expensive. So I was like, oh, I'll do the ebook. But then the ebook was only like $10 cheaper than the print book. So I kind of got, that's where I kind of got bogged down, and I tried doing more websites. But that's actually a good idea. I don't know why I didn't decide. I get books all there all the time. I don't know why I didn't think of getting those books. So that's actually a really good idea. So about that time. So would you say, how much of your stories would you say is historical and how much is fiction? Do you kind of just go, do you have a particular proportion? I know some historical fiction authors try to do like a proportion, but do you just kind of go with the flow? And kind
so
of
I don't have a proportion. My main well, some of the books are more linked to historical events than others, but really it's for me, I have a mantra, which is authenticity over accuracy, story over history. So for me, it's the story, the plot, the authenticity. It needs to feel real. So it needs to feel like it's the real period, and it needs to have an interesting story. And I think those are the things I care about. So if it ends up being 80% fiction and 20% history, as long as it feels authentic and it doesn't really, break any historical timelines, then I'm okay with that. A Night of Flames, for example, follows on from the historical events in the first book, which is the attack on Lindisfarne. But then after the attack on Lindisfarne, which is a historical event, the Viking attack on Lindisfarne, after that, pretty much everything in the rest of A Time for Swords and then the sequel in Night of Flames, pretty much everything is fiction. But every now and again, I'll mention a historical character, like they go and visit the king or whatever, but really the storyline is all fiction. So I'd say probably that's about 90% fiction, but hopefully it feels very authentic. So the places they go to and the weapons they use and the people they meet are real, but the actual storyline, which in A Night of Flames is pretty much, well, without going into too much detail, the A Time for Swords is basically a kind of a retelling of Seven Samurai / Magnificent Seven, but set in the Dark Ages. A Night of Flames, a large part of it is very much a nod to Heart of Darkness by Conrad and John Milius's script for Apocalypse Now. So it's very much it's Apocalypse Now in the Dark Ages, basically, as well.
Oh, that's cool.
So they're going up a river in search of a mad guy, and
that's awesome.
And things happen.
You had me at Seven Samurai. Magnificent Seven. Yeah, those are awesome. Oh, that's super cool. I definitely look forward to those. So who are some of your favorite authors that make you want to write?
Well, I mentioned Bernard Cornwell, so I'd have to say he's one of my favorite authors. For a long time. David Gemmell, obviously great fantasy writer, one of my favorite novelists, especially when I was younger. I used to read his stuff. I mean, sadly, he's no more. I actually loved his first book, Legend, and my story, Wolf of Wessex, is very much a nod to Legend. It's this solitary old man. I said, he's got a dog where Druss doesn't, but he's basically Druss. He's got an axe in it. His axe is in Wolf of Wessex. His axe is called Diathan Genga, which in Old English means Death Walker. Which,
that's cool.
So it's very much my nod to David Gemmell. I think David Gemmell was a huge inspiration to many, 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 not just fantasy writers, but historical fiction writers. Because yesterday I was having a chat with Ben Kane on my YouTube channel, and he was saying, somebody asked on the live chat, said, what's your favorite book that you've written? And he said, one of my favorite books is I can't remember which one of the Eagles series that he's written. And he said the character in it is basically a nod to Druss from David Gemmell's Legend. And it's funny because I said, well, I've written this thing as well. So obviously he's been a huge inspiration for both of us. Yeah. And he's not the first guy that I've heard that from. So other writers, I really like Larry McMurtry, who wrote Lonesome Dove, obviously in the Western theme. It's fantastic. Lonesome Dove is one of my favorite books. And more recently, a guy called Toby Clements.
Okay.
And he wrote 4 books, or he has written 4 books in a series called The Winter Pilgrims. And it's set in the time of the Wars of the Roses.
Oh, that's cool.
and I've never read anything else really much about the Wars of the Roses, but fantastic, really good. Really recommend him. He's been a big influence on my writing as well, and I think he hasn't written anything else under his name. I think he might be writing some other stuff under pseudonyms or something, but under that name he doesn't seem to be writing anymore, and they were really good. So very much recommend those.
I have to definitely check those out. I'm always, like I said, I'm always looking for something. I've been doing all sorts of analyzing for different things.
If you get that first one, he writes in a very immediate style. I think it's in present tense, which is unusual for historical fiction, but it works well. And he writes one chapter. There's a man and a woman. At the beginning, they don't know each other, but they meet quite early on in the first book, and then their story combines and they go together to the rest of the stories. But it's one chapter from his perspective, one chapter from her perspective, and it goes like that all the way through. But you don't go back over the story. It's just always pushing forward. Cool. And it does it really well. And I used that same structure actually in Wolf of Wessex there's the guy, the main character Dunstan, and the young girl that he's sort of traveling with in that. And I did the same. I had the male and female protagonists, cool, and 50-50 for each. And it works really well. And I really enjoyed that. And it kind of, you know, even if you basically fall in love with both the characters, and it's great seeing the sort of conflict between them. And sometimes, you know, they get very close, and other times they get angry with each other, and you can kind of see the the reasons why, and it's really good.
Oh, that sounds awesome. I like that.
It doesn't sort of fall into a trap of being a bit twee or anything. They become there's a love interest between them, but it feels very rooted and grounded and believable.
Oh, that's really awesome. Yeah, I definitely have to check that out. I love that time period too. So for that last one, so do you have any current projects, promotions, news, or updates that you'd like to share with us?
Well, I've mentioned all my books. I mean, the next book is Forest of Foes. The latest book that's out at the moment is A Night of Flames. So if anyone wants to pick that up, it's out in audiobook and in ebook and hardback. And so, get that and see what you think. I haven't mentioned that I have been in the process over the last few years of working with a small team trying to get a TV series off the ground for the Serpent Sword. So if anyone's got any contacts and they want to help us out, but if you want to watch a proof of concept trailer that we put together just before lockdown, actually in 2020, you can go and look on theserpentsword.com. or on my website, matthewharffy.com, and you can read all about the project there. And it was done on a shoestring budget to kind of show what we could do, but actually, looks amazing. The team, really talented young guys, and we've got a script for the pilot. We've got a series Bible written and working with a screenwriter, Greg Stewart. It's been great fun, but we're kind of struggling to navigate the world of Hollywood and work out how on earth you go from one thing to the next. We've met with some important people. We met with some cool people, but I think it's just notoriously complex. And so if anyone's listening and they're like, an agent or someone working in Hollywood, or they know a producer that's interested and wants to make some fantastic TV, go and watch theserpentsword.com online, and then come back and contact us and let us know, because we'd love to talk to you.
Yeah, I need more. Last Kingdom is done.
Absolutely.
3-hour movie is not enough for me. The Vikings TV show is done. The other one was, Valhalla was pretty good, but I need more.
Check out our trailer. See what you think.
Yeah. I'm definitely going to check that out today. I got some time before heading to my last.
It's only a couple of minutes. It really is a trailer. We created it to be a standalone trailer, but it's got original music, and it's very professional. It looks really great. So
that's awesome.
See what you think.
Yeah, definitely have to check that out. I will definitely be sharing that today with everybody. So I can't wait to take a look. Matthew, I really appreciate you coming on. I saw, a couple people sharing your books the other day. I was like, oh, that looks really cool. Sounds really cool. So I'm definitely glad that we were able to, meet and talk. So any other time you want to come on, chit chat about history, if you want to bring Ben with you, that's fine too. We'll talk about whatever, as long as there's like some sort of swords or, conflict with humans, or, some sort of good story and writing there, we'll chit chat and have a good time. So thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you very much for having me. And thanks for everyone for listening too.
Yeah. So make sure you go to Matthew's socials again. as my audience knows, everything is always in the description. All of his links will be there. So, make sure you go and check those out, and, buy all of his books. That way, we can get a TV series going for him, and I will be happy. So
that sounds good.
That's awesome. Well, Matthew, you have a great rest of the day, and I will see you later, my friend.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.